Lights behind you. Open that iris up.
I'd like to ask you to have a seat and we'll get our afternoon program started. This reminds me of a church I once saw that builds up from the back and moves forward. We've got the middle section empty. I want to welcome you to this afternoon's program. And we have some special guests that are with us here today that I'd like to especially recognize. I don't see them all here, but if I do call your name, would you please stand up and let us recognize your being here. I know that we have from the Department of World Trade, Jim Antonick. Jim? We have some special guests with us today from the Peninsula Chamber of Commerce. Al Tompkins, who is the executive of the Chamber. Al? And I believe Cynthia Bates was, Cynthia here? No. Some of our friends from area industry are with us today, including Jack Boyd from Canon. Jack. Bruce Euler from Kenya, is he here? Steve Abel from Opton. Steve. And we have visiting us for the lecture today, representing the Virginia Community College System, Carlisle Ramsey. Carlisle. In addition, we have a number of our friends from our local school divisions that are here today, and a member of our college board, Marjorie Funk. Marjorie, would you stand, please? Marjorie is our board member representing York County. My purpose here today is to help set the climate or the tone for this afternoon's presentation, which is what in the world is going on. I looked at today's newspaper for an answer or a hint. President Bush is in Cartagena admitting that the United States has a drug problem. The Soviet Union has taken the lead in world disarmament. Democracy is sweeping and the winds of change are blowing through Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany, Poland, several republics of the Soviet Union, and South Africa. The unthinkable of two Germanys are talking about reunification. And the countries of Western Europe are creating a unified European community within 2 years. That's all very encouraging. But meanwhile, for almost 900 million people on this earth, approximately 1/6 of mankind, the march of human progress has become a retreat. The third world's debt is now in the order of $1 trillion, owed mostly to the United States, Japan, and Western Europe. For most of Africa and Latin America, average incomes have been falling during the 1980s to now a percentage, which is 25% less than it was in 1980. In the 37 poorest countries in the world, spending on health per person has dropped 50%. 350 million people are without work, and 1 child in every 10 in the world dies before its first birthday. What in the world is going on? And what is our responsibility as educators, working with today's and tomorrow's generation? What is our challenge? Well, I want to thank Ann Dowd and members of the International Education Committee for creating this forum today for us to examine those questions. And as I leave you to the rest of the program, I'm reminded of the words of President John F. Kennedy in one of his addresses before the United Nations General Assembly, and it could be a message to our educators. He said, "We have the power to make this the best generation of mankind in the history of the world, or to make it the last." So with that, I'll turn the program over to Ann and have her introduce the speaker. Ann?
Our program here today recognizes that international education must play an increasingly important role in the education we provide our students. To some of us, international education may mean study abroad, very laudable, foreign language study, and even better geography skills. But international education is really all that and much more. It is not just a set of skills to be mastered or a curriculum to be learned. It is above all an awareness and a valuing of the other cultures and other peoples in this world. In January, our college received a grant from the Virginia Community College system to internationalize 3 courses in the business area of our college. And that grant illustrates, to my mind, the system's and this college's belief in the importance of tailoring our curriculum to reflect that international perspective. In the last year, we in this world have witnessed almost unbelievable political and economic changes in China, in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, and most recently in South Africa. But most of us cannot yet fathom what these changes will mean and mean for us personally. Our guest today, Mr. Van Wishard, is here to help us unravel that problem and to understand how these world changes will affect us. Mr. Wishard is an analyst who has written extensively with 2 articles recently in 1987 in the Futurist magazine, a very interesting publication. He has served as special assistant to the Secretary of Commerce during the Reagan administration, and he has been a consultant to many industries and companies, including Dow Chemical Company, and currently he is the head of his own firm as a consultant on global trends. We are delighted to be able to welcome Mr. Van Wishard to our college today. Mr. Van Wishard.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank particularly Ann Dowd for all she has done, and Dr. Templin for the invitation to be here. I hope you'll bear with me in the next few minutes, because my voice is not normally this way. It's just that on the way down here I got some kind of a bug. But it's wonderful to see a community come together for such an occasion. And this to me is one of the delights and one of the strengths of the community college system. There's a family that comes together which you sometimes don't get with 80,000 people on the campus of Ohio State University. It's wonderful. I've been invited to make some comments on international education. Let me start by suggesting a couple of points. One is that I suspect most of you, or many of you, saw the article in the Washington Post on January the 21st, which talked about the explosion of international education taking place in Virginia's colleges and universities. The Post reports, quote, "The formation of proposals to increase international awareness at state universities has become a virtual cottage industry. Nearly every university has tailored brand new visions for the challenge, better to prepare today's youth for tomorrow's marketplace." Close quote, which was very encouraging. But then they get to the essence of the matter. No matter, quote, "no matter what topic, what field you go into, you cannot avoid the international implications." And that to me sums it up. Every single subject taught has, in one way or another, international implications. And I suspect that's equally true for community colleges as it is for state universities. A second observation I would make is maybe more in the way of a question than a statement. I wonder whether the very term international education isn't somewhat deceptive. Having something called international education suggests that there's an alternative, perhaps national education or domestic education. But in today's world, life has global dimensions that directly affect every one of us, whether we recognize it or not. Students must learn about the globe in order to have any hope of understanding the very forces that are shaping their existence. One could almost say that any education that does not orient students to the world around them is simply an inadequate education. You know, we used to talk about the global village, and international education was teaching people about the global village. Well, it's a global living room at this point. And international education, I think, is meant to teach people about the global living room. Just take a couple of vignettes. Dallas is the world's most popular TV drama. CNN gives leaders in Tokyo, Washington, and Moscow at the same time the same image of news is going on around the world. The whole world watches Tiananmen Square simultaneously and hard. Look at the multicultural mix that's taking place. Los Angeles is the second largest Mexican city. 1/3 of all Jamaicans live in the United States. Look at the religious mix that's taking place. Chicago, there are more Muslims than Methodists in Chicago, more Buddhists than Presbyterians. Look at the globalization of libraries. Harvard University gets half of its new stock of books every year from foreign sources. Miami is now the northernmost city of Latin America. And we now have a 24-hour foreign exchange market. So it's a global living room. And what I would like to do in the next few minutes is try and talk a little bit about the context of change that's taking place worldwide as we consider international education. How change is taking place on a global scale. That to me, understanding that to me, is international education. I start by suggesting that there are very few times in history when the entire context of human existence changes. When people start to view life and reality in a totally new way. Now, such a shift probably took place with the invention of language or with the development of writing. It certainly took place with the Copernican revolution. I would suggest that today the world is in the midst of just such another shift in the context of human existence. So let's look at two things. How is this context of life changing, and what does it mean for us? All right, how is it changing? First, the world is at the end of a 450-year period where the white nations bordering the Atlantic Ocean dominated world political, economic, and military affairs. And you see this in three ways now. You see it in the rise of the Pacific Basin as a world economic power. You see it in the fact that there is no single West European nation that's a world power, and Europe as a whole is searching for their role in life. And the third way you see it is in the end of the American predominance of world economic and military affairs that we enjoyed roughly from 1945 to 1973. Another point, we have entered an era where, at least for the major nations, vast expenditures of military armaments are now counterproductive in terms of national security. For example, both the US and the Soviet Union are trying to become weaker militarily while we maintain a proportional balance. Another point, the power to create change, as well as the attitude that change is desirable, is now a global possession. Throughout most of history, in most parts of the world, life was relatively static, and continuity, rather than change, was the norm. The idea of purposeful change, that people could shape their own destiny, really only emerged in Europe in about the 17th century. Now, change is the global norm. Simultaneous technological change taking place around the earth at the same time. It's an absolutely new fact of history. And so is the corollary, that what happens, a change that takes place on one side of the earth, has instant repercussions on the other side of the earth. This is an absolutely new fact in the 6,000-year history of the human race. For the first time in 2,000 years, the great world religions are seeing a diminishing of their role as the central cohesive force in society. As the eminent British historian J.M. Roberts puts it, until our own day, all civilizations have had some sort of ordered religious belief at their core. We are the first great civilization not to be bound together by some common religious conviction. Another change that you see taking place. Electronics is increasingly replacing typography as the main form of communication. Now remember, we're talking about the context of life in which we live and do business, and in which we relate to the rest of the world. Whether it's in public information, whether business or education, electronic communication is taking the place of print communication. And modes of communication have historically determined the structure of culture, of education, of thought itself. So as our mode of communication changes, there are going to be changes in all these other departments of life as well. Another change. In the advanced industrial countries, there's a redefinition of the respective roles of men and women taking place. Now, you can't get a much more fundamental change in society than that. And this and other developments is leading to a redefinition of the family. Such shifts are having profound implications for how we transmit culture, how we train our young people, and for the very act of self-government itself. Because the family is the basic unit of self-government, and you change the composition of the family, and you ultimately have a ripple effect right up the scale. Another more visible change that we've seen over the last months, the end of 140 years of Marxism as a serious intellectual mode of organizing life. At the same time, communism, as we have known it for the last 72 years, seems to be coming to an end. And in this sense, what's happening in Eastern Europe could be seen as part of the end of the age of empire. The modern age of empire started in the 15th, 16th century with Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, and Russia. And the modern age of empire is ending in the 20th century. The British lost their empire, the French lost theirs, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans, and now, finally, the Soviet Union is losing their empire. It's the end of the age of empire. We also see the emergence of a worldwide system of research, production, finance, and marketing. For example, a semiconductor chip that's designed in California. The design is sent by computer to Scotland, where the parts are fabricated. The parts are then sent to Taiwan, where they're tested and assembled, and then sent back to Europe or the United States for sale and use. It's a global system, economic production now. In the same way, finance is now global, and finance is driving the world economy. World trade comes to roughly $2.5 trillion a year. World financial flows are well over $80 trillion a year. And along with this is the advent of the World Corporation, which views the entire developed world as a single market. Then another change in this shifting context that we've been talking about is we have come to the end of the age of science as a means, as a source of new truth and meaning about life. Now by this I mean that in the Western world for at least 1,500 years, the church was the central source of meaning and truth about life. Then in the 17th century, science began to be the fountainhead of insight and understanding. Now this is not to suggest that the church is going to disappear or did disappear. Obviously it didn't. But it ceased to provide the inner dynamic of Western life and culture. Now we've come to the end of a roughly 400-year period where science acted as the primary interpreter of what life is all about. Now obviously science is going to continue to play its part, And I personally believe we have much greater scientific discoveries ahead of us than we have had thus far, particularly when you get into quantum physics. But we're moving beyond science as the primary generator of meaning. And one reason for this is that the whole scientific method is based on reductionism, reducing life to its discrete parts. But we've entered a phase of life where life needs to be seen whole. It needs to be seen in its entirety to be understood. For the first time in history, we see the Earth as one entity. And we need an understanding that is based on wholeness rather than on reductionism. And this right there, to my mind, goes to the very core of why international education is so essential. Because we need to see the Earth and life in its totality. Then I think it could be argued that we appear to have come, if not to the end, at least to a pause in the ideal of progress as a motivating force in life. Somehow we're going by momentum. We're not driven as a people by a conviction and a sense that life is getting better and we're going somewhere and it's progressing in every way. Every day life is moving forward in a better way. Well, these are some of the micro trends, and if you'll excuse me. These are some of the macro trends, what might be called macro trends. Let's look at some of the micro trends. The advance of scientific knowledge. Now, knowledge is worldwide, and you know all this stuff about we've got to have controls on our knowledge and stuff. Technology is worldwide. Technology, the scientific knowledge doubles every 10 years. This means that all technology is obsolete within 5 to 7 years. In electronics, it's 2 to 3 years. The torrent of new knowledge means that a company has to recover, if it produces a new electronic gimmick of some sort, it has to recover its production costs within 3 to 6 months before a competitor comes along with a look-alike that's going to compete in the marketplace for it. Computers, trillions of calculations per second, a speed which divorces time from any human comprehension. Some experts are predicting that within another 2 decades, we'll have a very large-scale integrated circuit with a transistor that will be as small as a virus, and each chip will hold the equivalent of the street map of the entire United States. Eventually, they're talking about artificial intelligence that can duplicate the psychological activities that allow people to reason effectively. Computers that will make decisions based on emotional understanding, and even be able to go through personality changes such as those brought about by meditation and prayer. Biotechnology. By manipulating the DNA code, it's now possible, in theory, to take animal traits and put them into humans, and take human traits and put them into animals. This could eventually alter the definition of what it means to be a human being. Scientists are launching a $3 billion project to map the complete set of instructions tucked into the nucleus of each of the body's 100 trillion cells. Now, this program alone could rival in scope both the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program, and it could exceed them in importance. Another micro-trend, artificial life. And all of these things we're talking about now are not American properties. These are worldwide properties. The Japanese, the Germans, in some cases with computers, the Brazilians. I mean, this technology is flowing around the world. Artificial life. It's a new field of science, and it mixes the impulses of biology with the tools of computation. By looking beyond the usual materials of life, scientists hope to capture life's spirit. The animated, the energetic, the replicating, the evolved. This new science seeks to understand the very essence arising out of matter. As one scientist summed it up, I want to know what is the soul that created order. Well, all these developments that we've been talking about, to my mind, add up to tremendous new possibilities. It's almost like, I mean, for us to envision what's going to be ahead is somewhat like asking the ancient Egyptians to envision the world of lasers and heart transplants and global television. But there are other elements to this changing context. And we're still talking about the changing context of life that's taking place worldwide. Population. 18% of all the people who ever lived since the birth of Christ are alive right now. World population is 5 billion. It took millions and millions and millions of years to reach the first 1 billion increment. The next 1 billion increment is going to be reached in 11 years. One of the side effects, we were talking about Mexico earlier on. Take a place like Mexico City. 30 million people in Mexico City by the end of the 1990s. Now, 30 million people, that is not a city. That is a country within a country. 30 million people is larger than the Benelux countries. It's larger than Central America or Scandinavia. So we're moving into a realm where management of a city such as Mexico City is a far more difficult task than was the management of some of the great empires of the past. The flip side of this is that in Europe the population is declining. The German population will decline, the West German population will decline by 4 million people in the next 16 years. And in terms of West Germany, that holds true regardless of what happens with reunification. Last year, there were as many children born in Turkey and Egypt alone as were born in all 12 countries of the European community. In the next century, very earlier on in the next century, Germany, France, and Great Britain will be replaced on the list of the world's 25 most populous nations, to be replaced by South Korea, Zaire, and Morocco. Now, as these population shifts take place, they are going to raise fundamental questions of national identity. For instance, in France, 50% of those under 25 years of age will be of foreign origin in another dozen years. Well, now this is going to raise the question of what does it mean to be a Frenchman? A Frenchman or a German is not going to be what we have historically thought of as the population shifts take place around the world. Another area, the environment. Well, we've heard a lot about the environment in the last few years. So there's, with very good cause too. But basically, human activity is altering the Earth's surface and changing the atmosphere on such a scale and at such a rate that human beings have now become a competitor with natural forces for the balance of the environment. And it's a complete reversal of history. Because up to now, in terms of the environment, the primary concern has been how to protect human beings from the ravages of nature. Now the concern is how to protect nature from the excesses of human beings. Part of this changing context of life is the effect that technology is having on us. It may be changing our lives in ways that we had not originally intended. Take television. In his book, The Business of Science, Simon Ramo, who is the founder of TRW, notes that in the 1950s, when television first came out, at no point, here we had the greatest instrument in the history of the human race for influencing the mind of people. And at no point did anybody sit down and say, how is this instrument going to affect us as a country? How is it going to affect our institutions? How will it affect us as people? It was just wall-to-wall television right across America. Now, countless studies are showing that as the influence of print wanes, the content of politics, of business, of religion, of education, of anything else that comprises the public's business must be recast in terms that are suitable to television, which is to say, recast in terms of business entertainment and show business. Or computers. research is showing that many computer users tend to think of themselves in terms of mechanism rather than in terms of meaning. Children who have always defined themselves by drawing contrasts with animals, now confronted by computers and computerized toys, many children see their computer as their nearest neighbor. And something similar is happening with adolescents. Many are struggling to find their identity not in relationship to their families or their friends, but in relationship to video games or computers. Some experts think that computers now give us more information than we can reasonably use. For example, in the past 10 years, the data processing budgets for most major U.S. firms have increased an average of 12% a year, but productivity has only increased an average of 2% a year. We may have reached the point with computers where, as one expert says it, there's so much knowledge, it is now negative information. So much information that useful knowledge is actually reduced rather than increased. Then this shifting context of life has social effects as well. For example, in our relationships as people and as institutions, contracts increasingly are replacing trust. The population of the United States has increased 15% since 1970. The number of lawyers has increased 100%. In terms of both personal happiness and national policy, we are shifting more and more of the decision-making onto the courts. Another element of this shifting context, which is inevitable and is not necessarily negative, is the emotional upset that it's causing. The number of psychologists and clinical workers and psychiatrists has doubled in the last 2 decades. Government and private health insurance reports that what they are spending on psychiatric benefits is shooting up at 10 to 20% a year, faster than any other single medical cost. And stress alone is costing American business $150 billion a year. Now, the University of Louisville, in looking at all of this and trying to make sense of it, said that our mode of life itself, the way we live, is now our principal cause of illness. Now, if some of these facts seem depressing and people start to head for the window, let me remind you of the words of Alfred North Whitehead, who was a very wise English mathematician and philosopher. He said, "It is the first step of wisdom to recognize that the major advances of civilization are processes which all but wreck the society in which they occur." The major advances of civilization, that's what we're going through. The changing context of human existence. What we've been talking about thus far represents more change that must be absorbed and assimilated by people than ever before, by any generation before us in history. So what does all this mean? What does it mean what we've been talking about? What does it mean that we're talking about earlier on? Obviously, we don't know fully what it means, and finding out will be the central task of the 21st century. But certain themes already suggest themselves. Clearly, we must see life in a completely new way. And I'd like to consider this in 3 realms of life. What does it mean for America? What does it mean for our institutions? And what does it mean for us as individuals? For America, I think one very clear thing it means is that we need a new perspective. A completely new perspective. We're looking at 21st century needs with a 20th century and in some cases a 19th century perspective. And where you see this most clearly is in our economic capacities, which have evolved into new forms, but the political capacity to deal with the new problems that economic issues are raising is mired down in a completely outworn concept. So in this sense, the way we view life has now become our #1 problem. You know, it used to be said that all politics is local. I think it was O'Neill from Massachusetts who said this, all politics is local. But that's no longer true. The new reality is that local politics, whether it's dealing with pollution or whether it's protecting jobs, they have global implications. Thus, in this sense, all politics is ultimately global. Now, you know, in business, the common buzzword is globalization. And in fact, nearly 17% of America's corporate assets are overseas. But what we're talking about has got to go far deeper than a buzzword. We're talking about the way we view life, a global perspective. A new perspective, I think, means to see the globe as a whole. And that is the heart of international education, seeing the globe as a whole. One human community with a common destiny. Now, that's not a particularly new thought, but it must now become the dominant perspective and context for policy and action. For none of the major issues that we're faced with in the world today can be solved on the national level. Not the twin deficits, not the environment, not economic growth, not the world debt problem, not even drugs or AIDS. And a world perspective does not necessarily imply a world government. It does imply that leadership must now project a vision of the common destiny of humankind with such forcefulness that we move past the parochial barriers of state, of nation, of region that are currently preventing us from realizing the potential of the new age that is at hand. And precedence exists for lifting people above natural barriers, parochial attitudes. The founding of America, for instance, we had to move past simply the concept of states into the concept of a nation. The creation of the European community. France and Germany had fought 3 wars within 69 years, but they had to move past that to develop a concept of a continent. So there is precedence. I think probably in practical terms, this focuses in America's relationship with Japan, with the Soviet Union, with the European community, with the Third World, to say nothing of our relationship with our neighbors north and south. With Japan, for instance, there's a lot in the papers about our relationship with Japan. We're not dealing with just various elements of a U.S.-Japan relationship. We're also dealing with how the economic, technological, and human interaction between America and Japan affects the entire globe. The U.S.-Japan relationship is an inherent part of the organic membrane that links all nations together in one living, growing tissue. So in this sense, what is needed is not just a passing awareness of another country, a little smattering of language, or having passed through it once or twice, but rather an awareness of the globe as a whole. A second point for America to consider in finding a new perspective, and that's the restructuring of our approach to economics. No existing economic theory can explain the events of the past 15 years. Reality has outrun economic theory. Now, here again, you come to the global thing. Every earlier theory said that one economic entity or theory controlled economic activity. But in reality, we have several interacting economic spheres. We have a microeconomy of individuals and companies. We have macroeconomy of national governments. We have a world economy, which includes world corporations. And incidentally, 25% of the economic activity of the United States is controlled by decisions made outside the United States, which we cannot affect in any way. Then we may be headed towards regional economies. The European community, the Pacific Basin centered around Japan, and the North American economy. Also, earlier economic theories ignored resource depletion, health-related concerns, environmental damage. Hiring 10,000 people to clean up the Alaskan oil spill turns up as a plus for the Alaskan economy. Also, our present concepts of economics do not factor in technology development, innovation, or entrepreneurship. And if you go to an even deeper level, current economic models ignore factors such as cultural values, social costs, or human meaning and purpose. So in this sense, a new approach to economics must somehow include all of these elements. It must go beyond simply the short-term variables of monetary and fiscal policy and look at the long-term total environment, at creating and maintaining the right conditions for total living, as well as a strong and healthy economy. And the starting point for this may be an awareness that the economy rests in ecology, that our national economy and that the world economy rests in ecology. And we can't tinker with the economy without tinkering with the global ecology. Well, I would say a third thing we must consider as this context of life shifts. And you know, when you go through a shifting context of life, it's hard to see it in perspective. People sort of have an intuitive feel that the tectonic plates of life are shifting, and the old moorings don't seem to be holding. But nobody has come out and sort of explained to us, this is what's happening, and this is why our institutions are not working the way they used to, or this is why relationships are breaking down that used to be the cement of life. And in this sense, there is a need to give fresh meaning and content to the very concept of nationhood at a time when the assumptions of life are shifting and merging into new patterns. What does it mean? What does nationhood mean in the world the way it's changing so? With the emergence of a worldwide economic system, with TV blanketing the country with different cultures and values, with the growing ease of world travel, with ever-mounting immigration, nationhood is less and less rooted in one cultural tradition or even in clearly defined national interests. It's been very hard for the United States to clearly define what our national interest is over the last 2 decades. Take the Los Angeles school system, talking about redefining nationhood. There's 62 different nationalities in the Los Angeles school system. In UCLA, in the engineering school, there are more Asians in that engineering school than there are any other nationality. In California, minorities are the majority, and non-Hispanic whites are the minority. And opinion polls are showing that many Californians feel a closer affinity with the Pacific Basin than they do with the eastern seaboard of the United States. Now, what does that do to any shared sense of purpose as far as nationhood is concerned? One indication of the need for a fresh expression of the underlying assumptions that bind us together as a nation is the America in Decline syndrome. And it's not new, but it's a sincerely felt perception, and no people are going to give their best if they feel the country's going down the tube. So it's worth talking about it just for a second, because it affects every single one of us. The fallacy of the America in Decline syndrome is that it only looks at America in relationship to certain fixed past measurements. And it fails to take into consideration that the whole context of human existence is changing. We can only understand America's condition by viewing it within a wider vision. And the wider vision sees the industrialization of Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, and possibly eventually China. It sees the creation of world corporations which plan and manufacture and market on a global basis. The wider vision sees young people of today knowing more about their world than young people of a bygone era knew about their country. It sees members of the human race, however haltingly, moving out and eventually living somewhere else other than on Earth. It sees the embryonic outlines of a world community coming into being. In short, the wider vision sees the whole frame of human activity changing, and thus, inevitably, within this changing context, America's role and relationship with the rest of the world has got to change. So, in this sense, the wider vision does not speak of decline, but rather it seeks to inspire the highest and the best in the American people to undertake the tasks that a new phase of our experience imposes on us. And very much related to this, to giving America a new purpose, is the need for managers and educators and politicians to understand what our culture is saying to us and learn to compensate for it. 3 quotes, in my mind, characterize our contemporary culture. Saul Bellow talks of, quote, a culture that has been emptied of meaning and feeling. Newsweek describes some of our TV shows. Quote, this is Newsweek, not me. Sadomasochistic bondage, near explicit masturbation, a dog lapping up the blood of a murder victim, a psychotic father setting fire to his sleeping son, talk shows interviewing strippers, lurid recreations of rapes, shootings, and stabbings. The article concludes by saying, anything goes as long as it gets an audience. Then summing all this up, Walker Percy writes, despite great scientific and technological achievements, Americans have not the faintest idea of who we are or what we're doing. So basically, we end up with a contemporary culture that tells us there is no enduring meaning to life, there's nothing beyond material acquisition, sensual pleasure, or technical wizardry. Well, clearly, such a culture is creating serious contradictions. We have more military hardware than we've ever had before, but we feel less secure, despite what's happening between the US and the Soviet Union right now. We have more sophisticated technology, which multiplies our means of doing things, but we are increasingly unclear on what our human purposes are that we're trying to achieve. We have greater wealth and more leisure, but it's not producing more happiness and contentment. We have better communication systems, but do we have a greater sense of community as a people as a result of better communication systems? In sum, more information about life is not producing greater wisdom about how to live. Something else that our culture is doing is to offer the concept of survival as a principal theme in national life. Nuclear survival, survival in the executive jungle, survival in marriage, survival in Wall Street, financial survival in hard times. Indeed, the survival of the planet. That's what I said earlier on. The end of the ideal of progress to be replaced by the hope of survival. Now, how do you get students and managers and employees and anybody else for that matter to give their best when the culture is telling us that the overriding issue is survival? Well, you don't. You get out-thought and you get out-hustled by another nation like Japan, whose culture is not talking about survival, but is talking about a glorious new role that is opening up worldwide for that country. So this question of national purpose for a new phase of the American experiment becomes critically important. Important to provide a cohesive sense of where we're heading during a new period of history. Important to give a sense of hope and possibility to our culture. And important to provide a compelling sense of the future for our young people. As a starting point in considering our purpose as a nation, I would offer this thought, that America prepare for a new century that is going to be as different from the 20th century as the 20th century was different from the 19th century. If we thought this through in terms of industrial management, education, healthcare, political structure, and international relationships, it would give focus to our efforts and provide a rationalizing purpose. To sum it all up in my mind, someone needs to do for this period of American history what Madison and Jefferson and other people did for an earlier period of our history. And what I'm talking about is not going to come out of think tanks. It's got to emerge from the heart and soul of the nation. It's an inner struggle that's got to take place. Okay, that's one realm, America. The second realm, our institutions, a new purpose for our institutions. We need to rethink the purpose of all our institutions. Purpose is now at least as important as process. As knowledge and technology develop, they change the context in which our institutions operate. And unless people and institutions adapt, they lose their former effectiveness. Thus, almost every institution is in crisis today. Few governments anywhere in the world are working well, whether they're democratic or totalitarian. No educational system on the whole is producing people equipped to cope with the complexities and the interrelatedness of the 21st century. Organized religion of every stripe is in crisis, and people are seeking solace in all sorts of unconventional beliefs and therapies. The family is less and less the fundamental training ground for social conduct. Now, this institutional breakdown is happening not because everyone is incompetent. They're not. It's happening because new technologies have created new possibilities which are altering the context in which all institutions operate. For example, technology is changing the nature of authority. Availability of information has eroded the old concept of hierarchical authority, and it's pushing decision-making down to lower and lower levels in every institution. And you see this in business. One result is institutional restructuring. In 1988, there were 3,637 mergers and acquisitions. This was a 40% increase over 1987. Then in the whole realm of education, there's been a lot of reconsideration since A Nation at Risk in 1983 on the purpose of education and how we're doing. But I sometimes wonder whether we're asking the basic question. We're asking how can we improve our educational system. But I wonder whether in an age when all information is available by the press of a button on a computer, when kids get more information from a television set than they do from 16 years of high school, whether we shouldn't be asking, what is education? Our whole concept of education was developed in a national setting that was agricultural. There was limited population shifts from one part of the country to another. It was based on the predictability of Newtonian physics. The culture was typographical. The nation state was the outer boundary of our political awareness. The meaning of words such as life, death, person, they were fixed and unarguable. Communications was slow enough so that time and distance cushioned us from an overabundance of information, and technological and social change was relatively slow. And there were fixed beliefs which provided moorings for life. We developed an education that was suitable for that kind of life. But those conditions no longer exist. They're gone. Our culture is electronic. Our political awareness is global. Quantum mechanics stresses uncertainty and unpredictability. Agricultural and industrial modes have given way to an information era. 10% of the population moves every 5 years. Biotechnology means there is no longer a fixed definition of what a person is. And we no longer have any definitive meaning for life or death. Communication is instant, and as such, it's eliminated time and distance. And as happens whenever one age yields to a new period, old expressions of enduring truth are struggling to be born at the deepest level of the psyche. Now, one nation that clearly understands this, again, is Japan. Speaking to a conference of Japanese educators, former Prime Minister Nakasone said this: "Fundamentally, the problem is, I feel, that education has failed to keep pace with the changes brought by the rapid transition from traditional society to a new social system." For instance, he went on, what can be done when the ties that were forged over centuries, binding traditional society together, are broken? Furthermore, what leverage can parents and teachers use to exert their influence when the media in our advanced information age provide far more information to our children than that provided by parents or teachers? It could be argued, I think maybe, what Nakasone was highlighting, that possibly the most influential educators in America today are the TV scriptwriters. In a sense, they're shaping attitudes and to a certain extent our knowledge. And TV is teaching our children that education must be entertaining, it must take the form of storytelling, it must be delivered in packages with no sequence or continuity, and it must make no demands other than just to watch. It was interesting, you may have seen in the paper a few days ago, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They had a test on geography. Two interesting points struck me about it. Students who had never taken geography courses scored just as well as those who had had geography courses. And the second point was that the students who had taken geography courses, the information that they put down on that they knew and were able to relate had not come from the geography course, but had come from watching TV. If we really want to address the basic reality in our educational system, we're going to have to encourage America's culture shapers to begin to express themes that will inspire an entire generation to reach forward for a new age. We must call for new motifs in TV and in cinema that summon forth what is best in the national character, rather than dramatizing what is basest. This is an essential part, in my judgment, of regearing America's education for the future. And I wonder whether the professional educators aren't the people in the strongest position to call for such new cultural themes. I say this because, in my judgment, our current cultural climate is undercutting everything that educators are trying to do. I realize that many of these things that we're talking about, I'm asking more questions than I am giving answers. But we obviously need to increase the quality of our current education so that our youth are at least the equal of the youth in the rest of the world in traditional subjects. And of course we need technological literacy for a period of history that's driven by technology. But as we emphasize more math and more science, it's worth remembering that during the second half of the 18th century, the French were the great mathematicians of the world, but it was the British who launched the Industrial Revolution. And in this sense, national destinies are determined by factors other than solely academic achievement. Finally, we come to the third area, a new balance for the individual. What does this mean for us individually? The personal implications of what we've been talking about. What it means, I think, basically, is that we as individuals need to understand the central struggle for the coming decade and century. And the central struggle is not going to be between nation and nation, or class and class, or between race and race. The central struggle is going to be for the individual, for us to know who we are, why we are here, what we're rooted in, and what we're living for. It means being integrated with every part of ourselves and at home with people from every part of the world. At home with the Japanese, at home with the Russians, at home with the South Africans, indeed, at home with each other. And what this means, I think, in human terms, is that we must become whole people. We've got a rational side, which throughout the centuries has developed the physical and the technological side of life. Then there's the non-rational side, which we have, which developed the art and the culture and the spiritual meanings of life. But I think it's fair to say that ever since René Descartes, and especially over the past 100 years or so, these two sides have been out of balance. The rational side was posited as fact, reality. Anything scientific was fact. The non-rational side was posited as opinion, devoid of reality. Anything of a spiritual nature was simply somebody's opinion. Reality was said to be what could be quantified, measured, or verified through repeated experiment. Now this has had enormous benefits for Western civilization in a material sense, obviously. But we have paid a colossal price. And the price is that over the years we have alienated ourselves from the deepest roots of our own inner being. And we have distorted the human personality. We have created people who can absorb massive amounts of data. We can manage complex mechanical and bureaucratic systems. But we are unable to provide a depth of meaning that links the individual to some larger significance beyond material gain, technical achievement, or personal advancement. I don't think we could write the Declaration of Independence or the Gettysburg Address today if our lives depended on it. At its deepest level, the question is, how does the individual human spirit relate itself to something of everlasting and infinite significance? For it's only in that realm that we find meaning and purpose beyond the day-to-day requirements of making a living. To find such meaning and purpose, I suggest that we now need to give priority to the integrative elements of life, to sense, wholeness, intuition, trust, communication, openness, and generosity of spirit. And we must reinterpret the why of those ethical norms that the experience of 6,000 years of civilized life has taught us are essential for psychological and social health and happiness. The significance of all of this is that we have arrived at a point where the most crucial issues we are facing in the world today are issues about which science and technology have very little to say. At heart, they are human questions, not scientific questions. How shall we live together? How do we ensure that the children of the world are taken care of and there's enough food for the world? How do we cooperate to achieve common aims? How will we govern ourselves? How do we create peace between competing factions? How do we train our children to know what is right and true? And how does the human spirit predominate in an age that's driven by technology? And last but certainly not least, what gives meaning to life after a certain level of affluence has been reached? Clearly, we are at a point where for the first time in history, we see the earth whole. We see the whole human community in its entirety. And we're beginning to have an awareness of the human community as a single entity. To live in such a new circumstance, we obviously have to develop the inner wholeness of the individual. Basically, we must find a new balance, a dynamic equilibrium between our inner and our outer life. And I think this is the fundamental issue at work in the life of every Western nation. And in this sense, at the very deepest level, America and the Soviet Union are facing exactly the same problem. although it manifests itself in completely different ways. In some, we must integrate every mode of culture, every human potential, into some larger universal purpose and pattern. This vision of wholeness, this sense of common being and destiny, is our most urgent need, and I believe it's the key to the future. What we're talking about is the question of belief. For it is belief and the habits and conventions that belief engenders that is the core of civilized life. Without common belief, there is no civilization. Belief plus vitalizing hopes. Vitalizing hopes. For hope is the vision of possibility. A new belief, a new hope for a new era of the American experiment. Well, where does this leave us? First of all, these issues obviously are extremely complex and interwoven, and they're not going to be solved next week or next month and not in the next few years. There is no quick fix. But what we've been talking about is, in my judgment, the essence of international education. We've been talking about something that goes way beyond traditional geopolitical relationships. We've been talking about life as it is being lived on the planet. And it's just such a planetary life we must prepare our young people to cope with. In closing, let me say that personally I am tremendously optimistic and hopeful about the future. The changes in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in South Africa, the Philippines, South America, in a sense, in one sense, these changes mean we're clearing away the unfinished business of the 20th century so we can begin a new century with a new order of affairs. We're clearing away the debris, the leftover business of the 20th century so we can start an absolutely fresh page in another 10 years. Another sign of hope. The search that's taking place. Never have Americans been seeking and searching for a higher meaning to life than they are today. And in this sense, it's a global search, and it is a natural thing that happens at each new stage of history. Another sign of hope. For the first time in history, we have the technical means to solve all of humankind's problems, of hunger, of shelter, of work. We have a more sensitive awareness of our relationship to our natural environment than ever before. That's a tremendous advance. The ability of human beings to rectify great injustices, such as slavery, imperialism, or racism, is a tremendous sign of hope. Another sign of hope is the capacity of the human spirit to endure, to keep reaching forward. Whether the gulag or the ghetto, the human spirit is unquenchable. Finally, the greatest sign of hope is each new child that comes into the world. For every child is a link with an eternal unknown and is the source of renewal and fresh life. And for those of you who are instructors and are in education, yours is a privileged profession to help those young people grow and understand life in its totality, a totality which is the very core of international education. Thank you.
Before you get comfortable, I'd like for you to join me up here for to commemorate your visit with us and to have us reflect upon what's next in the stage of the American experiment. We'd like to remember that this area was the birthplace of the last stage of the American experiment. And to commemorate that, we'd like to present you with a pen and ink drawing of the Nelson House in Yorktown, the birthplace of the American experiment. So thank you very much for being here.
Very much indeed. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Thank you. And I believe that we have a reception right beyond the doors here for those of you that can remain with us. If there are questions, we have some time where Van might be able to answer those. I see one right here.
Okay, one of the introducers mentioned the fact that the third world has actually gone to decline in various ways, and it seems to be kind of strange that the fact that other countries have gotten ahead and technology has increased. Can you sort of maybe come up with a basic summary of what it is that went wrong with the third world?
A basic summary of what it is that went wrong with the third world?
Yeah.
I'm not sure anything went wrong with the third world. I think it may be the first world where things went wrong. I don't know how to answer that question, quite frankly, because you cannot categorize the third world. I mean, each country is different, and each place has its own unique problems. I think one place that gives me great hope is when you look at what's happened in Malaysia and Singapore and Hong Kong and Korea and Taiwan the last 20 years. I mean, it was not too long ago that many of those countries were what we would consider third world countries. But through their educational system, through their market mechanisms, and I think this is, well, I'll put my finger on one thing. London School of Economics, if you really want to know, trained a whole generation of African leaders in a philosophy that did not produce wealth. It was a philosophy on how to distribute wealth, but not how to produce it. Then I think America, we've got our own sins to look at in our own backyard. Corporations, I think in some countries, American corporations, they've been beneficial, they've provided jobs, they've done a lot. But at the same time, I'm not sure we've done all we could to upgrade and train and create conditions for growth and for welfare. But it's an extremely complex issue, and you can't generalize on that.
All the ideas are so complex. How do you get those kind of ideas? Or any thoughts on how you get those kind of ideas to the nation and potentially improve sound bites on people?
I'm doing what I can. I don't know. There are shoots. There are shoots of hope. People are reaching. I mean, I don't think you get an expression out of Washington which explains what we're going through and talks about these kinds of things. But I've talked to high school audiences all across the country. And the seniors in high school understand this far more than the congressmen in Washington do. I'm serious. I'm absolutely serious. You can get into a more intelligent conversation with the seniors in most high schools in this country in terms of what we've just been discussing than you can with 95% of the congressmen or bureaucrats in Washington. And there's a search going on with the young people. You know, U2 and Bono, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. We're somewhere between Graceland. What was it? This is the age of this is the age of wonder and then Phil Collins. Why is this such a land of confusion? I mean, we're somewhere in between those two. This is the age of wonder and something or other on the one hand, but they understand it, and that to me is a great hope. Yeah.
With the decline of the traditional sources of meaning, value, and ethics, such as the church, the family, and the nation, in the 21st century, will meaning come from the individual only, or will there be new institutions that you see on the horizon?
I think it will come basically from individuals. Now, those individuals may be in institutions, but meaning. Don't want to wipe the institutions out. No, seriously, it's not a question of institutions. It's a question of people. It's a question of people searching and seeking and creating something new. So it can come from all sorts of sources.
Do you feel that the globe will become the new institution?
I beg your pardon?
The globe will become the new institution.
That the globe
Yeah,
will become an institution?
yeah, the planet as a whole.
No, I don't think so. I think it's that is one institution that's a little bit too big for us to manage. Yeah.
When you were giving the three quotes that summarize the current American position, starting with Saul Bellow, I was struck by the inherent androcentric bias in those three quotes. And what I immediately started focusing in on for the rest of your talk was that sort of perspective globally. It occurred to me that Carl Jung was right on when he said that we really have to come to grips with the animus and the anima, the male and female within us. I'm kind of uncomfortable with terms like masculine and feminine because they're so arbitrary and they vary from culture to culture. But I really think that as we move into the next century, this whole world would benefit from the feminization of power. Not to say that it's better for a woman to lead, because as long as she's male identified, it doesn't make any difference. But I think we have to look more toward cooperation than competition, and more toward mutuality than toward some sort of ego-centered minds.
I would agree with you fully. Okay, well, thank you very much.
See, I get your stuffing face. It's all set, the mic is all taken care of. called getting good food together.
But Pearl already hit
I know. The woman we've all grown to hate, right?
That's where I'll probably go eventually. That's what I heard. About 13 hours of videotape. I had to go all the way up